In the quiet hours before dawn on December 15th in the year 37 AD, a child entered the world in the coastal town of Antium. The sea air carried whispers through the villa's columns as Agrippina the Younger labored to bring forth her son. They named him Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, a name heavy with ancestral weight, though history would remember him by another. The astrologers who cast his horoscope that morning saw troubling signs in the heavens. When Agrippina asked them to read her infant's future, they spoke words that would chill any mother's heart. This boy would become emperor, they said, and he would kill his own mother. According to legend, Agrippina replied with words that revealed the steel in her soul. "Let him kill me, provided he becomes emperor." This was Rome in its twilight years of republican memory, though the republic itself had died decades earlier with Julius Caesar's crossing of the Rubicon. The child was born into the Julio-Claudian dynasty, that tangled web of ambition and blood that had transformed Rome from a republic into an empire. His great-great-grandfather was the divine Augustus, the man who had reshaped the world. His uncle was Caligula, whose madness would soon become legend. The very day of Nero's birth, his uncle Caligula sat upon the throne, already descending into the paranoid cruelty that would define his reign. The imperial court was a place where family ties meant
nothing and everything simultaneously.
Bonds that could elevate you to godhood or drag you to execution with equal swiftness. The infant knew nothing of prophecies or politics, of course. He simply drew his first breath in a world balanced on a knife's edge between grandeur and decay, between the dream of eternal Rome and the reality of human corruption. The omens had spoken. Time would reveal whether they were truth or merely the anxious imaginings of men who tried to read the future in the stars. And so began the life of a boy who would one day watch Rome burn. Whether by accident or design, history cannot say with certainty. But in that moment, in Antium by the sea, he was simply a child, crying his first cries, unaware of the terrible destiny that awaited. To understand the emperor, one must first understand the mother. Agrippina the Younger was perhaps the most dangerous woman in Rome. And that is not a statement made lightly in a city that had known Cleopatra and Livia. She carried the blood of Augustus in her veins, a fact she would never let anyone forget. Her father was the beloved General Germanicus, whose death had been mourned by all of Rome. Her mother, also named Agrippina, had been exiled and starved to death by the paranoid Emperor Tiberius. Her brothers had died young, 2 executed, 1 perhaps poisoned. She herself had been exiled by Caligula, surviving on a barren island with nothing but her burning ambition to sustain her. This was the crucible that forged her. Where other women might have been broken, Agrippina was tempered into something harder than steel. She understood power in a way few men did, and she wielded her beauty and intellect as weapons every bit as deadly as a gladius. When Caligula was assassinated in 41 AD, plunged into by Praetorian blades in a dark corridor, Agrippina saw opportunity. Her uncle Claudius, stammering scholarly, seemingly harmless Claudius, became emperor almost by accident, found hiding behind a curtain by guards who needed anyone to place upon the throne. Agrippina returned from exile. She watched, she planned, she observed how Claudius's wife, Messalina, played games with power until those games destroyed her. And when Messalina was executed for treason, Agrippina made her move. She seduced the aging emperor, convincing him to marry his own niece despite laws and customs that forbade such unions. For Agrippina understood something fundamental. In Rome, there was no law that could not be changed, no custom that could not be broken if you held the emperor's ear or his heart. But this marriage was never about love. It was about the boy, her son, Lucius. She needed Claudius to adopt him, to place him in line for the throne above Claudius's own biological son, Britannicus. And through a combination of seduction, manipulation, and political maneuvering that would have impressed Machiavelli himself, she achieved exactly that. Young Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus became Nero Claudius Caesar. He was now heir to the Roman Empire. The prophecy was beginning to unfold. The boy who would become Nero learned early that family meant danger. In the imperial palace, love was a liability and trust could be fatal. These were lessons written in blood across the marble floors where his relatives had fallen. During those years in exile with his mother, when Caligula had banished them both, the young Lucius lived in poverty. His mother's estates had been confiscated. They survived on the charity of relatives and the fading memory of his father's name. His actual father, Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, had died when the boy was only 3. A man remembered by history as cruel and dissolute, who once deliberately ran over a child with his chariot in the Roman Forum. But exile taught the boy resilience. He watched his mother maintain her dignity even in degradation, saw how she never stopped planning, never stopped believing that they would return. And when they did return after Caligula's assassination, he witnessed firsthand the precariousness of imperial favor. In the palace under Claudius, death walked the corridors dressed in purple. The young Nero saw how Messalina orchestrated the destruction of those she perceived as threats, how whispered accusations could lead to midnight arrests and dawn executions. He learned to read the subtle signs of shifting allegiances, to understand that today's ally might be tomorrow's corpse. His tutors tried to give him a proper education. They taught him Greek literature and rhetoric, introduced him to philosophy and the arts. He showed particular talent for music and poetry, passions that would later scandalize Rome, but which as a child seemed merely charming eccentricities of a sensitive youth. Yet beneath the lessons in Homer and Virgil, beneath the music and the drawing, another education was taking place. He watched his mother climb back into power through sheer force of will. He observed how she eliminated obstacles with the precision of a surgeon cutting away diseased flesh. He saw Britannicus, Claudius's biological son, treated with increasingly obvious disfavor as his mother maneuvered Nero into position as primary heir. The boy was learning the fundamental truth of imperial Rome. You survived by being useful, by being dangerous, or by being emperor. There was no fourth option. Every smile concealed a dagger. Every embrace might be the last. And somewhere in those formative years, as he grew from child to adolescent in that palace of beautiful poisons, Nero learned perhaps the most dangerous lesson of all, that if you were going to live in fear, it was better to be the one others feared. When Agrippina secured her position as empress, she understood that her son needed more than mere legitimacy. He needed polish, gravitas, the appearance of wisdom that would make Rome's elite accept this boy as their future master. For this delicate task, she chose Seneca the Younger, the greatest philosopher in Rome. It was an ironic choice. Seneca had been exiled by Claudius years earlier, banished to Corsica on charges of adultery with Caligula's sister. He had spent 8 years on that barren rock, writing philosophical treatises about the virtues of poverty and accepting one's fate. Agrippina brought him back not out of mercy, but because she recognized his value. A Stoic philosopher tutoring the future emperor would send precisely the right message to Rome's intelligentsia. Seneca found in young Nero a surprisingly receptive student. The boy possessed genuine intellectual curiosity, a hunger for knowledge that went beyond mere duty. They read together the works of Homer and Virgil, explored the philosophical writings of the Greeks, debated ethics and virtue in the cool shadows of the palace gardens. Seneca taught him that a true ruler must master himself before he could master others, that power without wisdom was merely tyranny. Yet there was something troubling in this education. Seneca preached Stoic virtue, moderation, self-control, acceptance of fate, while simultaneously serving an empress whose ambition knew no bounds. He spoke of the philosopher king while grooming a boy who would inherit absolute power. The contradiction was not lost on the perceptive young student. Nero absorbed it all with the strange duality that would characterize his entire life. He embraced the philosophy, genuinely moved by Seneca's eloquence about virtue and justice. Yet he also understood, perhaps unconsciously, that these were tools, performances to be deployed when useful. Philosophy was another mask to wear, another role to play. But Seneca gave the boy something else beyond philosophy: permission to pursue beauty. The old tutor himself was a man of letters, a playwright and poet. He did not discourage Nero's artistic inclinations, but rather refined them. They discussed tragedy and comedy, the power of performance, the way words could move masses. In those quiet hours of study, a dangerous seed was planted. Nero began to dream not of being Rome's ruler, but of being Rome's greatest artist. He imagined himself on stage, his voice carrying across packed theaters, receiving ovations not for military victories, but for perfect delivery of a tragic monologue. Seneca perhaps did not realize what he was cultivating: an emperor who would value applause more than power, artistic glory more than military conquest. The lessons continued day after day, year after year. Stoic maxims about duty and virtue mixed with poetry and rhetoric, philosophy and performance, becoming hopelessly entangled in the young mind. Seneca was shaping his student carefully, but the material he worked with was more complex, more volatile than he understood. The marriage between Agrippina and Claudius in 49 AD shocked Rome, though by then Romans had learned that nothing should truly shock them anymore. An emperor marrying his own niece violated laws, both written and unwritten, offended decency and tradition. Yet Claudius, ever the scholar, simply had the laws changed to accommodate his desire. But make no mistake, this was Agrippina's seduction, not Claudius's conquest. The aging emperor, approaching 60, found himself outmaneuvered by a woman 30 years his younger, who understood power in ways his previous wives never had. Messalina had been executed for treason and sexual excess. Now, Claudius turned to his niece, perhaps believing family ties might ensure loyalty. How wrong he was. Agrippina moved through the palace like a general executing a campaign. Her first objective: legitimize her son's claim to the throne. Within a year of the marriage, she convinced Claudius to adopt 12-year-old Nero, making him legally the emperor's son and heir. Young Britannicus, Claudius's biological child, was suddenly pushed aside despite being the natural successor. She consolidated power with methodical precision. Political rivals disappeared, some exiled, others executed on convenient charges of treason. She accumulated titles unprecedented for a Roman woman, Augusta, a designation previously reserved for emperors. Her face appeared on coins alongside her husband's. She attended Senate meetings behind a curtain, a silent presence that nevertheless made senators acutely aware of who truly held influence. The palace became her chessboard. She positioned loyalists in key positions throughout the government and military. She cultivated the Praetorian Guard, knowing that in Rome, power ultimately rested with those who controlled the swords. Money flowed to the right people. Promises were made and kept. A network of obligation and fear spread out from her like a spider's web. Claudius, meanwhile, seemed to drift in a fog of confusion. His health was declining. He suffered from what ancient sources describe as tremors and confusion, perhaps the early stages of dementia, perhaps something more sinister. Some historians whisper that Agrippina was slowly poisoning him, administering small doses that clouded his mind while keeping him alive long enough to serve her purposes. She orchestrated Nero's betrothal to Claudius's daughter Octavia, further entangling the bloodlines, making her son's claim to the throne increasingly undeniable. The boy was now adopted son, stepson, and son-in-law to the emperor all at once. Every legal and familial tie that could bind him to the throne had been secured. Through it all, Agrippina maintained the appearance of devoted wife and loving mother. She walked through Rome's streets distributing grain to the poor, presented herself as the embodiment of traditional Roman womanhood, even as she shattered every tradition that limited female power. By 54 AD, everything was in place. Nero was 17, officially an adult by Roman law, trained in philosophy and rhetoric, married to the emperor's daughter, adopted as primary heir. Claudius had served his purpose. All that remained was for him to die, and die he would at precisely the right moment, in precisely the right way. Whether by Agrippina's hand or merely by fortune's favor, history cannot say with certainty, but the timing was impeccable. As Nero matured in the palace, he existed in a strange twilight state, neither truly a prince nor yet an emperor, powerful beyond most Romans' dreams, yet subordinate to those who held real authority. These were the years when he learned what power actually meant, not in philosophy books, but in the brutal reality of imperial politics. His relationship with Britannicus, Claudius's biological son, was particularly complex. They had been raised together, these two boys with impossible destinies. History preserves few details of their interactions, but one can imagine the tension. Britannicus watched his inheritance stolen by this interloper, this adopted brother who had no right to what should have been his. Nero, for his part, must have felt both guilt and fear. Guilt for displacing someone who had never wronged him. Fear of what might happen if Britannicus ever regained favor. They moved around each other carefully in the palace corridors. Britannicus was younger, still a boy when Nero was entering manhood. Perhaps there were moments of genuine brotherhood, games played in the gardens, shared tutors and shared meals. But always, hanging over them like a sword, was the unspoken question. Which of them would ultimately wear the purple? Meanwhile, Nero was learning statecraft through observation and careful instruction. Seneca and Burrus, the praetorian prefect whom Agrippina had appointed, guided him through the labyrinth of Roman governance. He attended court sessions, watched his stepfather dispense justice, learned how laws were made and broken. He saw how emperors balanced the competing demands of senate, army, and mob, the three pillars upon which imperial power rested. But his heart was not in governance. His heart was in the art. Nero's passion for music, poetry, and performance grew stronger with each passing year. He would practice the lyre for hours, his fingers moving across the strings with increasing skill. He wrote poetry, epic verses about gods and heroes. He studied tragic actors, mimicking their gestures and vocal techniques. He became obsessed with chariot racing, not as a spectator, but as a potential participant, dreaming of racing in the great games. For a Roman aristocrat, such pursuits were acceptable as hobbies, but Nero approached them with an intensity that bordered on obsession. He wanted to perform publicly to receive the acclaim of audiences. This was scandalous. Roman emperors were warriors and statesmen, not entertainers. The stage was for freedmen and slaves, not for the master of the world. Agrippina watched her son's artistic inclinations with growing alarm. She had raised him to be emperor, not artist. But controlling Nero was becoming increasingly difficult as he matured. He had inherited not just imperial bloodlines, but also a will as strong as her own. There were other lessons too, darker ones. He witnessed his mother's ruthlessness firsthand, saw how she eliminated obstacles without hesitation or remorse. He learned that love could be weaponized, that family ties meant nothing when power was at stake. He absorbed the fundamental truth of imperial Rome. Mercy was weakness, and weakness was death. Yet something in him resisted becoming the cold, calculating ruler his mother envisioned. The sensitive boy who loved poetry and music coexisted uneasily with the prince who was learning to survive in Rome's deadliest arena. This duality, artist and autocrat, philosopher and predator, would define his entire reign. As October of 54 AD approached, Nero stood on the threshold. 17 years old, educated by the greatest minds in Rome, married to Octavia, positioned as heir apparent. Everything his mother had planned was about to come to fruition. All that remained was for Claudius to eat his final meal. On the night of October 12, 54 AD, Emperor Claudius attended a feast on the Capitoline Hill. The dinner was pleasant. The wine flowed freely, and among the dishes served were mushrooms, Caesar's mushrooms. They were called boletus edulis, a delicacy the emperor particularly enjoyed. He ate heartily, laughed with his companions, and seemed in good spirits despite his advancing years and declining health. By midnight, he was violently ill. Convulsions racked his body. He vomited repeatedly, his face contorted in agony. The palace physicians were summoned, but there was little they could do. Claudius lingered through the night, alternating between consciousness and delirium, his body betraying him with every passing hour. Shortly after dawn on October 13th, the Emperor of Rome died in his bed. He was 63 years old. The official cause was listed as food poisoning, an unfortunate accident with tainted mushrooms. But whispers began immediately, spreading through the palace like poison through veins. The mushrooms, they said, had been prepared by Locusta, a notorious poisoner known to have connections with Agrippina. Others claimed the emperor's food taster, a eunuch named Helotus, had been bribed. Some versions of the story suggest that when the initial poisoning didn't work quickly enough, Claudius's physician Xenophon administered a second, fatal dose hidden in a feather that was supposedly being used to help the emperor vomit. Agrippina moved with the precision of someone who had planned for exactly this moment. While Claudius's body still lay warm, she secured the palace. Guards loyal to her surrounded the imperial residence. Britannicus was confined to his rooms, prevented from seeing his dying father. Messages were sent to key military commanders and provincial governors, preparing them for the transition. The Praetorian Guard was summoned. When they gathered in the palace courtyard, 17-year-old Nero emerged from the building, guided by Burrus, the Praetorian prefect. The soldiers hesitated for just a moment. This was not the man they had sworn to protect, but Burrus's presence reassured them, and Agrippina's careful cultivation of their loyalty over the previous years paid dividends. They hailed Nero as emperor. The Senate, meeting in emergency session, had little choice but to ratify what the swords had already decided. Young Nero Claudius Caesar became the 5th emperor of Rome, the youngest to ever hold the title. He delivered a eulogy for Claudius written by Seneca, praising the dead emperor's wisdom and justice, speaking movingly of his grief at losing a father and mentor. Claudius was deified, declared a god by Senate decree. Temples would be built in his honor. Priests would offer sacrifices to his divine spirit. Yet, even as these honors were proclaimed, everyone knew the truth that could never be spoken aloud. The divine Claudius had been murdered, and his killer had probably been the mother of his successor. History would debate the truth of Claudius's death for centuries. Ancient sources differ wildly in their accounts. Modern historians remain divided. Perhaps it was murder. Perhaps it truly was accidental poisoning. Perhaps Agrippina simply had extraordinary timing. But one thing was certain. On that October morning, as priests carried Claudius's body to the funeral pyre, a new age had begun. The age of Nero, and Rome would never be the same. The first 5 years of Nero's reign would later be remembered with something approaching nostalgia. Historians would call it the Quinquennium Neronis, Nero's 5-year period, a time when Rome seemed to rediscover the promise of good governance, when an emperor ruled with wisdom and restraint. But this was not truly Nero's rule. It was Seneca's philosophy married to Burrus's military pragmatism, filtered through the voice and face of a teenage emperor. The young man on the throne delivered speeches written by his old tutor, implemented policies crafted by experienced advisors, and presided over a government that ran surprisingly well, considering its figurehead had barely outgrown adolescence. Seneca's influence was everywhere. The emperor's early speeches to the Senate echoed Stoic principles: justice, mercy, respect for senatorial privilege. Nero promised to respect the Senate's traditional authority, to avoid the tyrannical excesses of previous emperors. He would not be a Caligula, he assured them. He would not be a Tiberius. He would rule with wisdom and compassion. And remarkably, for a time, he did. Taxes were reduced. Corruption was addressed. The grain supply to Rome's masses was secured and expanded. Nero sponsored public games and entertainments on a scale that delighted the populace. He was generous with donations to disaster-stricken cities, quick to provide relief when fire or earthquake struck. The provinces were generally well governed under his appointees. In the law courts, Nero showed unexpected mercy. He abolished secret trials and informers. He insisted that accused persons should have the right to defend themselves. These were revolutionary principles in a Rome accustomed to imperial caprice and paranoia. People began to believe that perhaps finally they had a good emperor. The young ruler also revealed artistic sensibilities that, if scandalous to some traditionalists, charmed many Romans. He patronized poets and artists. He opened his palace to performances and literary readings. He himself wrote verse and practiced music, though at this stage still privately. Not yet daring to perform before audiences, his marriage to Octavia was presented as a model of imperial propriety, though in truth it was loveless and political. Still, the appearance mattered. Rome saw a young emperor and his young empress, symbols of a fresh start for the empire. Agrippina, however, grew increasingly frustrated. She had placed her son on the throne, expecting to rule through him, but Seneca and Burrus had effectively boxed her out. They understood that Nero needed to be seen as his own man, not his mother's puppet. Government decisions were made in council meetings where Agrippina was increasingly excluded. When she tried to intervene in state affairs, she found herself politely but firmly rebuffed. The tension between mother and son grew. Agrippina had sacrificed everything, her dignity, her morals, possibly even her soul, to make Nero emperor. Now he was emperor, and he didn't need her anymore. Or so Seneca and Burrus carefully encouraged him to believe. Yet beneath this golden surface, beneath the good governance and popular approval, something darker was stirring.
Nero was learning that he could do anything, literally anything, and face no real consequences.
When Britannicus looked at him with resentful eyes at palace banquets, Nero began to wonder what would happen if that young man decided to claim his birthright. When Agrippina lectured him about his duties, he began to think, what would it feel like to be truly free of her control? The Quinquennium Neronis was real and it was good, but it was also temporary. The mask of the philosopher king was already beginning to slip, revealing something more complex and dangerous beneath. The boy emperor was becoming a man, and the man wanted more than virtue and wisdom. He wanted power, and he wanted applause. The first 5 years of Nero's reign would later be remembered with something approaching nostalgia. Historians would call it the Quinquennium Neronis, Nero's 5-year period, a time when Rome seemed to rediscover the promise of good governance, when an emperor ruled with wisdom and restraint. But this was not truly Nero's rule. It was Seneca's philosophy married to Burrus's military pragmatism, filtered through the voice and face of a teenage emperor. The young man on the throne delivered speeches written by his old tutor, implemented policies crafted by experienced advisors, and presided over a government that ran surprisingly well, considering its figurehead had barely outgrown adolescence. Seneca's influence was everywhere. The emperor's early speeches to the Senate echoed Stoic principles: justice, mercy, respect for senatorial privilege. Nero promised to respect the Senate's traditional authority, to avoid the tyrannical excesses of previous emperors. He would not be a Caligula, he assured them. He would not be a Tiberius. He would rule with wisdom and compassion. And remarkably, for a time, he did. Taxes were reduced. Corruption was addressed. The grain supply to Rome's masses was secured and expanded. Nero sponsored public games and entertainments on a scale that delighted the populace. He was generous with donations to disaster-stricken cities, quick to provide relief when fire or earthquake struck. The provinces were generally well governed under his appointees. In the law courts, Nero showed unexpected mercy. He abolished secret trials and informers. He insisted that accused persons should have the right to defend themselves. These were revolutionary principles in a Rome accustomed to imperial caprice and paranoia. People began to believe that perhaps finally they had a good emperor. The young ruler also revealed artistic sensibilities that, if scandalous to some traditionalists, charmed many Romans. He patronized poets and artists. He opened his palace to performances and literary readings. He himself wrote verse and practiced music, though at this stage still privately. Not yet daring to perform before audiences, his marriage to Octavia was presented as a model of imperial propriety, though in truth it was loveless and political. Still, the appearance mattered. Rome saw a young emperor and his young empress, symbols of a fresh start for the empire. Agrippina, however, grew increasingly frustrated. She had placed her son on the throne, expecting to rule through him, but Seneca and Burrus had effectively boxed her out. They understood that Nero needed to be seen as his own man, not his mother's puppet. Government decisions were made in council meetings where Agrippina was increasingly excluded. When she tried to intervene in state affairs, she found herself politely but firmly rebuffed. The tension between mother and son grew. Agrippina had sacrificed everything, her dignity, her morals, possibly even her soul, to make Nero emperor. Now he was emperor, and he didn't need her anymore, or so Seneca and Burrus carefully encouraged him to believe. Yet beneath this golden surface, beneath the good governance and popular approval, something darker was stirring.
Nero was learning that he could do anything, literally anything, and face no real consequences.
When Britannicus looked at him with resentful eyes at palace banquets, Nero began to wonder what would happen if that young man decided to claim his birthright. When Agrippina lectured him about his duties, he began to think, what would it feel like to be truly free of her control? The quinquennium Neronis was real, and it was good, but it was also temporary. The mask of the philosopher king was already beginning to slip, revealing something more complex and dangerous beneath. The boy emperor was becoming a man, and the man wanted more than virtue and wisdom. He wanted power, and he wanted applause. The feast was held on February 11th, 55 AD, in one of the palace's smaller dining halls. It was a family affair. Nero, his mother Agrippina, his wife Octavia, and young Britannicus, now 14 years old. The atmosphere should have been warm, fraternal, a gathering of Rome's imperial family sharing wine and conversation. But family gatherings in the imperial palace were never simple affairs. They were performances, each participant playing roles, speaking lines, watching for subtext and hidden meaning. And on this particular evening, Death had been invited to dine. Britannicus was served wine. In those days, it was customary for emperors and their families to have food tasters, slaves who would sample every dish and drink before it reached imperial lips. Britannicus's wine was tasted, found safe, and handed to him. He took a sip and complained it was too hot. Cold water was added to cool it. He drank again. Within moments his body seized. Convulsions overtook him. He fell from his couch, foam erupting from his mouth, his young body twisting in agony on the marble floor. The room erupted in chaos. Servants rushed forward.
Agrippina froze, her face a mask of horror. Octavia wept. Nero remained reclining on his couch.
He continued eating, his expression calm. When someone suggested calling physicians, he waved them away. "This is nothing," he said casually. "Britannicus suffers from epilepsy. This has happened before."
He will recover, but Britannicus did not recover.
Within minutes, the 14-year-old boy, rightful heir to Claudius, biological son of an emperor, was dead on the floor, his eyes staring at nothing, his body still. The story was immediately clear to everyone present. The poison had not been in the wine itself, which the food taster had safely consumed. It had been in the cold water added afterward, the water that never touched the taster's lips. Locusta, that same poisoner who had allegedly dispatched Claudius, had struck again, this time under Nero's orders. Britannicus was buried that very night, in darkness and rain, without the ceremonies befitting an emperor's son. Nero claimed the sudden funeral was traditional for epileptics, but everyone understood the truth. He wanted the body disposed of before anyone could examine it too closely, before the inevitable discoloration that poisons left became too obvious. The Senate, when informed, accepted Nero's explanation. What choice did they have? The Praetorian Guard, loyal to Nero and Burrus, showed no signs of rebellion. The people of Rome, who had never particularly cared about Britannicus, barely noticed his passing. One teenage boy had died at a dinner party. Such things happened, but something had shifted. Seneca and Burrus, who had counseled the young emperor toward virtue and mercy, suddenly understood what they were dealing with. This was not just a student who had strayed from philosophical teachings. This was someone capable of murdering his own brother, adopted brother, but still in cold blood at a family dinner, and then calmly finishing his meal while the body cooled on the floor. Agrippina understood it too. She saw in her son's eyes something she had perhaps put there herself, the absolute certainty that power meant the freedom to do anything, to anyone, without consequence. She had taught him too well. He had learned not just to survive in Rome's deadly game, but to play it with ruthless efficiency. Nero was no longer the boy emperor guided by wise advisors. He was no longer Seneca's philosophical student or Agrippina's obedient son. He was emperor in truth now, and he had just demonstrated that anyone, even blood family, could be eliminated if they threatened his position. The golden age was ending. The mask was coming off, and Rome was about to discover what lurked beneath. She entered his life like a character from one of the Greek tragedies he loved so much, beautiful, intelligent, dangerous, and absolutely devastating to everyone around her. Poppaea Sabina was married to Nero's friend Otho when they first met, sometime around 58 AD. Within months, she would change everything. The ancient historians are not kind to Poppaea. Tacitus describes her as possessing every advantage except an honorable mind. But the historians were men of the Senate class, and Poppaea threatened their world. What they saw as manipulation and seduction might equally be described as a woman using the only weapons Roman society allowed her: beauty, intelligence, and the ability to influence powerful men. Nero was captivated. His marriage to Octavia had always been political, loveless, a union arranged by Agrippina to cement his claim to the throne. Octavia was virtuous, quiet, proper, everything a Roman empress should be. She was also, to Nero, utterly boring. She represented duty, obligation, the endless expectations that weighed on him like chains. Poppaea was different. She was witty, engaging, passionate. She shared his love of Greek culture and the arts. She encouraged his desires to perform publicly, to pursue his artistic dreams. Where Agrippina scolded and Seneca lectured about imperial dignity, Poppaea whispered that an emperor should do whatever he pleased. She understood the game of power, but she also understood pleasure, beauty, joy, all the things Nero craved but had been taught to restrain. Their affair began openly, scandalously. Nero sent Otho off to govern distant Lusitania, conveniently removing the inconvenient husband. Poppaea moved through the palace like a queen in waiting, and everyone knew what she represented: a rebellion against everything Agrippina had planned, everything Seneca had taught, everything traditional Rome expected. The conflict with Agrippina intensified dramatically. The Empress Mother saw Poppaea as a threat to everything she had built. If Nero divorced Octavia, daughter of Claudius, link to imperial legitimacy, it would undermine the very foundations of his claim to power. Agrippina confronted her son repeatedly, her anger and fear manifesting in bitter arguments that echoed through the palace corridors. But Poppaea was clever. She never directly challenged Agrippina. Instead, she subtly poisoned Nero's mind against his mother, framing every maternal concern as an attempt at control, every piece of advice as manipulation. She played on his resentments, his desire for independence, his artistic aspirations that Agrippina dismissed as shameful indulgences. More dangerously, Poppaea encouraged Nero's public performances. He had been practicing music and poetry for years, but always privately. Now he began to dream of performing before actual audiences, of competing in artistic competitions, of receiving the applause and acclaim he craved. For a Roman emperor, this was unthinkable. Such public display was beneath imperial dignity. But Poppaea told him he was not just an emperor, he was an artist, and artists must perform. The struggle between Agrippina and Poppaea was more than romantic drama. It was a battle for Nero's soul, for the very direction of the empire. Agrippina represented traditional Roman values, political pragmatism, calculated ruthlessness in service of power. Poppaea represented indulgence, artistic expression, the freedom to pursue desire without constraint. Nero found himself torn between the mother who had made him emperor and the woman who made him feel alive, between duty and desire, between the emperor Rome needed and the artist he wanted to be. The resolution, when it came, would be as terrible as any Greek tragedy. But for now, in those heated years around 58-59 AD, the palace was a pressure cooker of competing ambitions and desires. Agrippina grew increasingly desperate, allegedly even offering herself sexually to her son to regain influence, a story so scandalous that historians debate its truth to this day. But the truth was simpler and sadder. Agrippina had created a monster, and now the monster wanted to be free. Poppaea was merely the catalyst for what was perhaps always inevitable. The prophecy the astrologers had spoken at Nero's birth was about to be fulfilled. He would kill his mother,
and the entire world would watch in horror.
In March of 59 AD, Nero invited his mother to the coastal resort of Baiae for the festival of Minerva. The invitation seemed like reconciliation, a gesture of filial love after months of tension. Agrippina, perhaps desperate to believe her son still needed her, accepted. The celebrations were warm, almost tender. Nero embraced his mother, spoke softly with her, created the illusion of restored affection. When the time came for Agrippina to return home across the bay, Nero offered her his own ceremonial galley for the journey. It was a magnificent vessel, luxuriously appointed, worthy of an empress mother. What Agrippina did not know was that the ship had been specially designed to collapse.
Ingenious mechanisms had been installed to make the ceiling cave in, crushing whoever was beneath.
If that failed, the hull itself was designed to break apart, sending passengers into the dark waters. The ship sailed into the night. At a predetermined signal, the sealing mechanism was triggered. It collapsed, but not on Agrippina. Her friend and lady-in-waiting, Acerronia, was killed instantly. The hull began breaking apart as planned, and passengers plunged into the sea. But Agrippina, perhaps suspecting treachery, perhaps simply lucky, managed to swim away in the darkness. A passing fishing boat rescued her. She understood immediately what had happened.
Her son had tried to kill her.
Not in a moment of rage, not in a sudden violent impulse, but carefully, elaborately, with mechanical ingenuity. He had embraced her, smiled at her, and sent her to what should have been her death. She sent a messenger to Nero claiming the collapse was an accident, that she had survived by divine providence. It was a test. Would he express relief at her survival or reveal his guilt? Nero, upon hearing the message, panicked completely. He summoned his advisors, including Seneca and Burrus. "She will come back," he told them frantically. "She will raise the Praetorian Guard against me. She will turn the Senate. I will be destroyed." What happened next remains debated, but the result was clear. A group of soldiers led by the naval commander Anicetus was dispatched to Agrippina's villa. They arrived at dawn, surrounding the building. When Agrippina realized what was happening, she dismissed her few remaining servants, not wanting them to die for her. The soldiers broke down her door. They found her in her bedroom, alone, waiting. According to legend, and this may be legend rather than history, she pulled back her robes and pointed to her womb. "Strike here," she said. "Strike the womb that bore Nero." They killed her with multiple sword wounds. Her body was cremated that same night, without ceremony, without honor. The woman who had been Augusta, who had ruled Rome from behind the throne, who had murdered and schemed to make her son emperor, was reduced to ashes and dust. When news reached Rome, the Senate, always willing to please whoever held power, declared that Agrippina had been plotting against her son and that Nero had acted in self-defense. They voted thanksgivings to the gods for his deliverance. Seneca himself wrote the official statement justifying the murder, a fact that would haunt him for the rest of his days. But Nero could not escape so easily. Ancient sources claim he was haunted by nightmares, that he saw his mother's ghost, that he could never quite wash the blood from his hands. Whether these stories are true or invented by hostile historians, something fundamental changed in Nero after Agrippina's death. The one person who had always controlled him was gone. The one person who had always known exactly what he was capable of could no longer judge him. He was free. Free to be the artist he wanted to be. Free to pursue every desire. Free to become exactly what prophecy and circumstance had shaped him to be. The Golden Age was definitively over. The reign of blood had begun. The first time Nero performed publicly, in 64 AD at the Neronia Games he had established in Rome, it was as if all of Roman society held its breath in collective horror. An emperor, master of the world, heir to Augustus, commander of legions, stood on a stage like a common actor and sang to an audience. It was unthinkable. Roman emperors were supposed to be warriors, statesmen, conquerors. They might appreciate the arts as educated patrons, might attend performances as spectators in the imperial box. But they did not perform. That was for freedmen, for slaves, for people of no consequence. The dignity of Rome, the gravitas of empire, depended on emperors maintaining proper distance from such vulgar displays. Nero did not care. Or rather, he cared desperately, but about the wrong things from the Senate's perspective. He cared about the quality of his voice, the perfection of his lyre playing, the emotional authenticity of his tragic performances. He practiced obsessively, hired the best voice coaches, studied the techniques of famous actors. He observed strict dietary regimes to protect his vocal cords, lay with lead plates on his chest to strengthen his breath control. When he performed, audiences were required to remain for the entire performance. Guards locked the theatre doors.
Anyone who tried to leave was stopped.
Women reportedly gave birth during his recitals rather than risk the emperor's displeasure by departing early. Some men, desperate to escape, pretended to die so their bodies could be carried out. Yet Nero was not entirely without talent. Multiple sources, even those hostile to him, admit he had a pleasant voice and could play the lyre competently. What made it scandalous was not the quality but the fact of it, that an emperor would debase himself this way. His chariot racing was even worse in aristocratic eyes. He participated in actual races, competing against professional charioteers, getting dirty and sweaty like any common competitor. Once he was thrown from his chariot but insisted on continuing. He didn't win, but the judges awarded him the victory crown anyway. Who would dare judge an emperor fairly? He toured Greece in 66-67 AD, participating in all four major Greek games, the Olympics, Pythian, Nemean, and Isthmian. He collected over 1,800 first prizes, though everyone understood these were not earned through merit, but awarded out of fear. When he sang, the audience was coached in the proper way to applaud. Professional clappers were distributed throughout the crowd to lead the ovations. But here is the strange truth. Nero genuinely believed in his own talent. This was not cynicism or self-awareness. He convinced himself that the applause was real, that the accolades were earned. He would ask companions nervously after performances, "Was I good? Did you hear how they cheered?" He needed the validation with desperate sincerity. The Senate watched all this with a mixture of horror and helplessness. They had to attend his performances, had to applaud enthusiastically, had to praise his artistry while privately considering it the ultimate humiliation. Their emperor had become an entertainer, and they were forced to be his audience. Seneca and Burrus, who had guided the young emperor so carefully during the quinquennium, could no longer control him. Burrus died in 62 AD, perhaps naturally, perhaps poisoned. Seneca retired from court, spending his final years in philosophical contemplation, watching his former student descend into what he must have considered madness. But to Nero, this was freedom. This was the life he had always wanted. Not military glory or political achievement, but artistic immortality. He wanted to be remembered not as a conqueror, but as the greatest performer who ever lived. He wanted applause more than he wanted respect. It was, in its way, almost touching. This emperor, who would rather sing than rule, who valued artistic achievement over imperial dignity. If he had been born a private citizen, perhaps he would have been happy. But he was emperor of Rome, and Rome needed things from its emperors that Nero could not or would not provide. The tragedy was not that he lacked talent. The tragedy was that he had been given the wrong stage. On the night of July 18th, 64 AD, fire broke out in the shops lining the Circus Maximus. Rome was a tinderbox, narrow streets, wooden buildings, oil lamps, summer heat. Fires were common, but this one did not stop. Fanned by strong winds, the flames spread with terrifying speed through the city's congested neighborhoods. The fire burned for 6 days, then reignited and burned for 3 more. When it finally exhausted itself, 10 of Rome's 14 districts had been affected. 3 were completely destroyed, 7 severely damaged. Thousands were left homeless. The death toll remains unknown but was certainly substantial, and somewhere in the chaos of those 9 days, a legend was born. Nero fiddled while Rome burned. The historical truth is more complex. Nero was not even in Rome when the fire started. He was at his villa in Antium. When news reached him, he rushed back to the city. Ancient sources, even those hostile to him, acknowledge that he worked energetically to combat the disaster. He opened his gardens to refugees. He arranged for emergency grain supplies. He supervised firefighting efforts personally. Imperial buildings were torn down to create fire breaks. The fiddle story is certainly false. Fiddles did not exist in ancient Rome. The lyre did, and some versions claim Nero played his lyre and sang about the fall of Troy while watching Rome burn. But even this is likely invention by hostile historians. Tacitus, writing decades later, explicitly states he does not know where Nero was during the fire. Yet rumors spread immediately through the traumatized city. People had seen men throwing torches, preventing firefighting efforts. The flames had restarted mysteriously after being brought under control. Some whispered that Nero himself had ordered the fire, that he wanted to clear space for his architectural ambitions, that he watched the destruction with artistic appreciation, seeing beauty in catastrophe. Whether there was any truth to these accusations is unknowable. Nero did benefit from the fire. He used the cleared land to begin construction of his most ambitious project yet, the Domus Aurea, the Golden House. This was not merely a palace but a vast estate in the heart of Rome, covering over 300 acres. It included artificial lakes, gardens, forests, and buildings decorated with gold, precious stones, and elaborate frescoes. At last I can begin to live like a human being, Nero allegedly remarked when construction began. For him, the Golden House represented the ultimate artistic vision, a space where beauty and imperial power merged completely. It was to be his masterpiece, his lasting contribution to Roman civilization. But to Rome's homeless, crowded into temporary shelters, watching golden palace walls rise where their neighborhoods had stood, it looked like something else entirely. It looked like their suffering had been turned into his pleasure. It looked like he had sacrificed their city for his vanity. The fire of 64 AD became Nero's defining moment in popular imagination, whether he deserved the blame or not. The image of the emperor performing music while his capital burned captured something essential about how Romans had come to see him. A man who valued art and spectacle over the welfare of his people, who lived in dreams while reality crumbled around him. The truth, as always, was more complicated. But in the court of historical opinion, perception mattered more than truth. And the perception that Nero welcomed Rome's destruction because it gave him space to build his golden dreams would poison his legacy forever. The rumors would not stop. Despite Nero's relief efforts, despite his public works to rebuild the city, despite everything he did, the whispers persisted. The emperor had burned Rome. The political situation was becoming dangerous. The people needed someone to blame, and that blame was falling on Nero himself. So Nero gave them someone else to blame instead: the Christians. In 64 AD, Christianity was not yet a world religion, but a small, secretive sect, an offshoot of Judaism that most Romans barely understood. They refused to worship the traditional gods. They held strange rituals where they spoke of eating flesh and drinking blood. They talked about the world ending in fire. They were, in the eyes of most Romans, weird and vaguely threatening. Nero announced that investigations had revealed the truth. Christians had started the fire. Whether he believed this or simply found them convenient scapegoats remains unclear. Either way, arrests began. What followed was Rome's first organized persecution of Christians, a persecution that would echo through history and eventually be transformed by Christian tradition into the foundational martyrdom narrative of the faith. The details are murky, filtered through later Christian sources that had every reason to exaggerate and embellish. According to Tacitus, writing 50 years later, the punishments were deliberately spectacular and cruel. Some Christians were torn apart by dogs in the arena.
Others were crucified.
Still others were covered in pitch and set on fire to serve as human torches, illuminating Nero's gardens during evening festivities. Christian tradition holds that both St. Peter and St. Paul died during this persecution. Peter was allegedly crucified upside down at his own request, feeling unworthy to die in the same manner as Christ. Paul, being a Roman citizen, was granted the more dignified execution of beheading. These stories cannot be historically verified, but they became central to Christian martyrology and the establishment of Rome as a holy city in Christian imagination. Tacitus, no friend to Christians, nevertheless expressed discomfort with the persecutions. He wrote that although Christians were guilty of hatred of the human race and deserved punishment, the excessive cruelty of their executions generated sympathy. Nero was using their suffering for entertainment, and even Romans accustomed to violent spectacles found it distasteful. Whether the persecution was as extensive or as cruel as later sources claim remains debatable among historians. Christian sources had obvious incentives to dramatize their community's suffering. Nero needed scapegoats, but there is no evidence he conducted empire-wide persecution. The arrests seem to have been limited to Rome itself and to have been relatively brief. Yet, the significance transcended the immediate events. This was the first time Roman imperial power directly confronted Christianity. It established a pattern: Christians as outsiders, as threats to social order, as convenient scapegoats when things went wrong. It created the first martyrs whose stories would inspire generations of believers. It marked Christianity as something dangerous enough to warrant imperial attention. For Nero, it was a political calculation, a way to deflect blame and provide entertainment to the masses. He could not have imagined that the obscure sect he was persecuting would eventually conquer the empire that he represented, that the religion he tried to scapegoat would outlast the dynasty he embodied, that his name would be preserved in infamy largely because of what he did to these few hundred believers. The fire had destroyed much of Rome. Nero rebuilt it more beautifully than before, with wider streets and better building codes. He created his golden palace, his artistic masterpiece, and in doing so, he created martyrs whose blood would, in Christian tradition, become the seed of the faith that would eventually inherit Rome itself. History is full of such ironies. The persecutor becomes the villain in the story told by those he persecuted. The emperor who wanted to be remembered for his art is instead remembered for his cruelty. The fire that he may not have started becomes the fire that consumes his legacy. In April of 65 AD, a slave named Milicus came to the palace with a story that would unravel the most extensive conspiracy against an emperor in Roman history. His master, he claimed, had been sharpening daggers and preparing bandages. There were whispered meetings, coded messages, suspicious behavior. Something terrible was being planned. The interrogations began, and the truth emerged like poison from a wound. A vast network of conspirators had been plotting to assassinate Nero, not a handful of disgruntled soldiers, but dozens of Rome's elite. Senators, knights, military officers, even Praetorian Guard commanders. At the center was Gaius Calpurnius Piso, a wealthy aristocrat who the conspirators planned to install as emperor after Nero's death. The plot was ambitious. They would strike during the games at Nero's circus when the emperor was vulnerable and distracted. Piso would be proclaimed emperor immediately. The Praetorian Guard, whose prefect, Faenius Rufus, was himself a conspirator, would support the transition. The Senate would ratify it. Rome would be saved from its mad performing emperor. But the conspiracy was too large, involved too many people with too many different motivations. Some wanted to save the Republic. Some wanted personal advancement. Some simply hated Nero. Such diversity made security impossible. When Milicus betrayed them, the entire structure collapsed. Nero's response was swift and merciless. The arrests began immediately. Torture was applied liberally to extract names. The conspiracy, like a poisoned root system, spread wider and deeper than anyone had imagined. 19 senators and 7 Praetorian tribunes were implicated. Some died by execution. Others were allowed to commit suicide, preserving their families' property rights. Among those forced to die was Seneca, the old philosopher who had guided Nero's youth, who had written those beautiful speeches about mercy and virtue, who had perhaps tried to create a philosopher king, but had instead helped create a tyrant. He was not directly involved in the conspiracy, but his nephew Lucan, the famous poet, was deeply implicated. That connection was enough. Seneca received the order with stoic calm. He had taught for decades about accepting death with dignity, about the meaninglessness of physical existence compared to virtue. Now he would demonstrate those principles. He cut his veins in the traditional Roman manner, but his aged body bled slowly. He took poison. That too failed to work quickly. Finally, he was placed in a bath of hot water, the heat accelerating the blood loss until death came at last. His wife Paulina tried to die with him, cutting her own veins in a gesture of marital devotion. But Nero, perhaps feeling a flicker of remorse or perhaps simply wanting to demonstrate mercy, ordered her life saved. She lived on, pale from blood loss, a ghost haunting Rome with memories of what the empire had become. The poet Lucan, Seneca's nephew, was also forced to suicide. As he died, he recited lines from his own poetry about a soldier bleeding to death. Art and life merged in his final moments. Petronius, the arbiter of elegance who had taught Nero about refined taste, opened his veins while listening to poetry and joking with friends, showing contempt for death and emperor alike. The conspiracy's failure marked a turning point. Nero had always been paranoid. Who wouldn't be, growing up in that palace of poisoned mushrooms and midnight arrests? But now his paranoia had been validated. They had tried to kill him. Dozens of Rome's elite had conspired against him. If these men, senators he had dined with, officers he had promoted, intellectuals he had patronized, could betray him, then anyone could. Trust died with the conspirators. What replaced it was something darker, more primal.
Nero learned that safety required terror, that control required blood.
The emperor, who had wanted to be loved for his art, would settle for being feared for his power. The purges had begun, and they would not stop until either Rome or Nero was destroyed. After the Pisonian conspiracy, something broke inside Nero, or perhaps something that had always been broken simply became visible. The mask of the artist emperor cracked completely, revealing the paranoid tyrant beneath. The remaining years of his reign read like a catalogue of horror, a descent into the arbitrary cruelty that Romans most feared in their emperors. The executions multiplied. Anyone who had shown sympathy for the conspirators, anyone who had failed to show sufficient joy at their exposure, anyone who possessed wealth that Nero coveted, all became targets. The accusations were often absurd, the trials perfunctory. Guilt and innocence became meaningless categories. What mattered was suspicion, and Nero suspected everyone. Wealthy senators died and their fortunes were confiscated. Noble families that had survived centuries of Roman history were extinguished in an afternoon. The Senate, once the proud embodiment of Roman tradition, became a gallery of terrified men waiting to see who would be next. Attendance at Senate meetings became a form of torture. Anyone who spoke too much or too little might draw fatal attention. The system of delation, paid informers, flourished.
Anyone could accuse anyone of anything.
Slaves were tortured to extract evidence against their masters. Former friends betrayed each other for imperial favor or simply to save themselves. Trust became impossible. Every conversation might be reported, every word twisted into treason, and then, in 65 AD,
Nero murdered Poppaea, the woman who had changed his life, who had encouraged his artistic dreams,
who had been his partner in rebellion against everything his mother represented. The ancient sources claim he kicked her to death while she was pregnant, in a fit of rage because she had complained about him coming home late from the chariot races. Whether the death was truly murder or a tragic accident remains debated. Dio Cassius insists it was deliberate violence. Tacitus suggests it might have been accidental, that Nero kicked her in anger but did not intend to kill her. Either way, she died, along with the child she carried. Nero gave her a state funeral, had her body embalmed rather than cremated in the traditional Roman manner, delivered a eulogy praising her beauty. But Rome knew what had happened. The emperor had killed his pregnant wife.
After murdering his mother, after murdering Britannicus, after all the senators and nobles, now he had murdered the woman he supposedly loved.
There was no line he would not cross, no relationship sacred enough to guarantee safety. Nero's grief, whether genuine or performed, manifested in bizarre ways. He found a young freedman named Sporus who resembled Poppaea, had him castrated, dressed him in women's clothing, and married him in a full ceremony. He paraded through Rome with Sporus dressed as empress, kissing him publicly, treating him as if he were actually Poppaea reborn. To the horrified aristocracy, this was not just peculiar, it was obscene, a violation of every norm of Roman masculinity and propriety. The Golden House construction continued, consuming resources while the empire's infrastructure crumbled. Nero raised taxes to fund his architectural visions and his constant games and performances. He debased the currency, reducing the precious metal content of coins to stretch his budget. The economic strain was felt throughout the empire. His performances became more frequent, more elaborate. He would sing for hours, allowing no one to leave. He competed in the Olympics in Greece, awarded himself countless victory crowns regardless of his actual performance. He declared entire Greek cities free as rewards for their appreciation of his art. He brought back to Rome 1,000 victory wreaths, parading them through the streets as if they were military triumphs. Rome watched all this with a mixture of horror, disgust, and resignation. Their emperor was mad, but he controlled the Praetorian Guard and the legions. What could they do? They attended his performances, they applauded, they pretended to believe the fiction that he was the greatest artist who ever lived. But beneath the surface, something was shifting. In the provinces, in the legions, among the military commanders who had conquered Britain and held the Rhine and guarded the Danube, men were beginning to ask dangerous questions. What had this emperor ever done for Rome besides sing? What victories had he won besides theatrical competitions? What did he offer besides spectacle and terror? The answer, increasingly, was nothing. And when an emperor offered nothing, when the legions lost respect, when the Senate lost hope, when the people lost patience, that was when empires fell. The end began in March of 68 AD in the distant province of Hispania. Servius Sulpicius Galba, governor and commander of the legions there, was an old man, 73 years old, from an ancient noble family, a traditionalist who represented everything Nero was not. Serious where Nero was frivolous, austere where Nero was extravagant, military where Nero was artistic. Galba declared himself legate of the Senate and Roman people, not emperor, not yet, but clearly positioning himself as an alternative. His legions supported him. More critically, they sent word to other provincial armies, inviting them to join the rebellion. The response was swift. Gaius Julius Vindex, governor of Gaul, rose in revolt, though whether he supported Galba or sought power for himself remains unclear. His Gallic legions were defeated in battle, and Vindex committed suicide. But the rebellion did not die with him. It spread like fire through dry grass, legion after legion questioning their loyalty to an emperor who had never led them in battle, who had never shared their hardships, who seemed to care more about applause than about the empire's security. The critical moment came when the Praetorian Guard's loyalty wavered. These were the emperor's personal troops based in Rome itself. For years they had supported Nero, collecting their generous bonuses, enjoying their privileged position. But even they had limits. Their new prefect, Nymphidius Sabinus, began secretly negotiating with Galba, promising to deliver the guard in exchange for position and power in the new regime. When news of the revolts reached Nero, he initially seemed unable to grasp the magnitude of the crisis. He reportedly spent time designing siege equipment and planning how to respond. But his plans were theatrical rather than practical. He imagined going to the rebellious provinces personally, appearing before the troops without weapons, simply weeping until they were moved to repentance. He would then celebrate his victory by singing songs of triumph. His advisors watched this with despair. The emperor was living in a fantasy while his world collapsed around him. The Senate, sensing opportunity, began to turn. For years they had endured humiliation and terror under Nero's rule. Now, with legions in revolt and the Praetorian Guard wavering, they saw a chance to rid themselves of this nightmare. On June 8, 68 AD, they declared Nero a public enemy of Rome. The decree meant he was no longer protected by law. Anyone could kill him without penalty. His property was forfeit. His statues would be torn down. Nero learned of the Senate's declaration while hiding in the palace. The building was empty. Servants had fled. Guards had abandoned their posts. He was alone with a handful of loyal freedmen, the vast machinery of imperial power dissolving around him like morning mist. He tried to flee to Egypt, where he still had supporters, but no ship would carry him. He tried to rally the Praetorian Guard, but they would not come. He tried to reach the Senate to plead his case, but the streets were too dangerous. Every option closed, every door locked, every ally vanished. As dawn broke on June 9th, Nero heard the sound of cavalry approaching. Soldiers were coming to arrest him, to drag him through Rome's streets to the traditional execution, beaten to death with rods while his head was locked in a wooden fork. It was the death reserved for the lowest criminals, a public spectacle of humiliation and pain. The emperor, who had craved applause, who had wanted to be remembered as history's greatest artist, who had built a golden palace and collected 1,000 victory wreaths, would instead die like a common criminal in the Roman Forum. But he still had one choice left, one final performance, one last scene to play. If he could not control how he would be remembered, he could at least control how he would die. The soldiers were close now. There was no more time. The final act was about to begin. Night had fallen on June 8, 68 AD, when Nero realized he was alone. The vast imperial palace, with its hundreds of rooms and thousands of servants, echoed with emptiness. The Praetorian Guards, who should have been at their posts, had simply walked away. The freedmen and slaves who had served him had vanished into Rome's darkness. Even his closest companions had found urgent business elsewhere. He wandered the corridors calling for Sporus, for anyone, his voice swallowed by marble and silence. When he finally fell asleep, exhausted by fear, he woke to find even his bedchamber guards gone. They had taken the bedclothes and, more ominously, the box containing poison he kept for emergencies. Even the option of a quick, dignified death had been stolen from him. Desperate messages were sent to what few friends might remain. Most did not reply. One sent back a quote from Virgil. "Is it so terrible a thing to die?" It was a philosopher's answer, elegant and useless. Nero needed sanctuary, not philosophy. In the pre-dawn hours, he made his decision. He would flee Rome, hide somewhere, until he could determine his next move. Perhaps Egypt, perhaps the eastern provinces, perhaps one of the legions still loyal to him, though which legions those might be, he no longer knew. He disguised himself in a dark cloak and hood, a common freedman's clothes covering the imperial purple. 4 companions rode with him, his secretary Epaphroditos, Sporus still dressed as his phantom empress, and 2 others. They galloped through Rome's sleeping streets, heading for the Via Nomentana, away from the city that had been his stage and his prison. As they rode, Nero could hear the sounds of celebration beginning in the city behind them. People were tearing down his statues, defacing his images. The Senate had declared him public enemy. Rome was already erasing him, treating him as if he were already dead. About 4 miles outside Rome, they reached the modest suburban villa of Phaon, one of Nero's freedmen. This man, at least, had not entirely abandoned him. The villa was small, undistinguished, surrounded by gardens and a quarry, nothing like the palaces Nero had known. They could not enter through the front door for fear of being seen. Instead, they led Nero through brambles and thorns to a back entrance, finally into a small, cramped bedroom. The Emperor of Rome, master of the known world, builder of the Golden House, performer before thousands, hid in a servant's room, lying on a rough bed, drinking stagnant water from a muddy pool. He had fled his palace without eating, and someone offered him coarse bread. He refused it. Even now, even here, some part of him maintained imperial dignity. Outside, they could hear search parties moving through the countryside. Soldiers were looking for him, methodically checking villas and farms. It was only a matter of time. Nero knew this. His companions knew this. They waited in that small room as dawn light filtered through cracks in the walls, as the sound of hoofbeats grew closer. Nero asked them to begin digging a grave in the small space behind the villa, sized to fit his body. He wanted it done properly, with proper dimensions. Even his grave must be artistic. One of his companions wept. Another reminded him that speed was essential. The soldiers were very close now. As they dug, Nero reportedly kept murmuring to himself, "What an artist the world loses in me." It was not pride speaking, not anymore. It was grief, genuine grief for the performances never given, the songs never sung, the recognition never received. He had wanted to be remembered as Rome's greatest artist. Instead, he would die as its most reviled tyrant. The sound of horses was very close now. They could hear voices, soldiers calling to each other as they searched. Someone shouted that they had found fresh tracks leading to this villa. There was no more time. The grave was barely finished, hardly more than a shallow pit. Nero looked at the dagger his companions had brought him. His hands were shaking. The moment he had dreaded for 30 years, the moment his mother had prophesied at his birth, had finally arrived. But even now, at the very end, he hesitated. The sound of cavalry was unmistakable now, thundering down the path toward Phaon's villa. Nero held the dagger, but his hands trembled so badly he could not steady the blade. He had ordered deaths casually, Britannicus, Agrippina, Seneca, Poppaea, countless others, but But taking his own life was different. His nerve failed him repeatedly. "Have I neither friend nor foe?" he cried out, looking at his companions. It was almost a plea for someone else to end it, to spare him this final terrible choice. But they stood frozen, unable or unwilling to strike down the man who had been their emperor. He pressed the dagger to his throat several times, testing the spot, gathering courage, then pulling away. He quoted poetry, fragments of tragic verses about death and honor.
Even dying, he could not stop performing, could not stop searching for the perfect words to accompany the moment. "How ugly and vulgar my life has become,"
he lamented. It was perhaps his most honest statement, a flicker of genuine self-awareness breaking through years of delusion. The man who had wanted beauty in everything finally saw the grotesque reality of what his life had become. The sounds outside grew louder. Someone shouted that they had found the villa. Soldiers were dismounting. There were perhaps minutes left, perhaps only seconds. Epaphroditos, his secretary, saw Nero's paralysis and made the decision for him. He placed his hand over Nero's on the dagger and pushed, driving the blade into the emperor's throat. Blood erupted from the wound.
Nero collapsed, not dead, but dying, choking on his own blood as life drained from him. A centurion burst into the room, sent ahead of the main force.
He found the emperor on the floor in a spreading pool of blood. The soldier attempted to stanch the wound with his cloak, perhaps genuinely trying to save Nero's life. Alive, the emperor could be brought to Rome for public execution, which would have been far more satisfying to the new regime. But it was too late. Nero looked at the centurion through dimming eyes. Some sources claim his last words were, "Too late," or "This is fidelity." Others preserve what became his most famous final statement, words that captured everything about who he was and who he had wanted to be. "Qualis artifex pereo." What an artist dies in me.
Not what an emperor dies, not what a ruler dies, an artist.
To the very end, that was how he saw himself. Not as a failure of governance, but as a tragedy of unrealized artistic potential. The empire he had misruled, the people he had terrorized, the lives he had destroyed, all of that was secondary to the performances never given, the songs never perfectly sung, the acclaim never fully earned. He died shortly after, on June 9th, 68 AD, at the age of 30 years and 6 months. He had been emperor for 13 years, 8 months, and 13 days. The Julio-Claudian dynasty, which had ruled Rome since Augustus transformed it from republic to empire, died with him. His burial was hasty, incomplete. 2 of Nero's old nurses and a former mistress claimed the body. They cremated him on a pyre of expensive wood in the gardens of Domitia, the estate that had belonged to his father's family. His ashes were placed in a family tomb, no grand mausoleum, no state funeral, no divine honors, just ashes in a box. The mortal remains of an emperor who had wanted to be immortal. The soldier's cloak that the centurion had used to try to stanch his wound was stained with imperial blood. According to legend, that cloak eventually became a relic, preserved by those who believed, against all evidence,
against all reason, that Nero had not been a monster, but a martyr.
That his death was not justice, but tragedy. History would debate what he truly was. But in that small room, in that moment, he was simply a frightened man who could not bring himself to die with dignity, who needed help even to accomplish his own suicide, whose last thoughts were of applause that would never come. The curtain fell. The performance was over. The audience had already left. The sound of cavalry was unmistakable now, thundering down the path toward Phaon's villa.
Nero held the dagger, but his hands trembled so badly he could not steady the blade.
He had ordered deaths casually, Britannicus, Agrippina, Seneca, Poppaea, countless others, but taking his own life was different. His nerve failed him repeatedly. "Have I neither friend nor foe?" he cried out, looking at his companions. It was almost a plea for someone else to end it, to spare him this final terrible choice. But they stood frozen, unable or unwilling to strike down the man who had been their emperor. He pressed the dagger to his throat several times, testing the spot, gathering courage, then pulling away. He quoted poetry, fragments of tragic verses about death and honor.
Even dying, he could not stop performing, could not stop searching for the perfect words to accompany the moment. "How ugly and vulgar my life has become,"
he lamented. It was perhaps his most honest statement, a flicker of genuine self-awareness breaking through years of delusion. The man who had wanted beauty in everything finally saw the grotesque reality of what his life had become. The sounds outside grew louder. Someone shouted that they had found the villa. Soldiers were dismounting. There were perhaps minutes left, perhaps only seconds. Epaphroditos, his secretary, saw Nero's paralysis and made the decision for him. He placed his hand over Nero's on the dagger and pushed, driving the blade into the emperor's throat. Blood erupted from the wound.
Nero collapsed, not dead, but dying, choking on his own blood as life drained from him. A centurion burst into the room, sent ahead of the main force.
He found the emperor on the floor in a spreading pool of blood. The soldier attempted to stanch the wound with his cloak, perhaps genuinely trying to save Nero's life. Alive, the emperor could be brought to Rome for public execution, which would have been far more satisfying to the new regime. But it was too late. Nero looked at the centurion through dimming eyes. Some sources claim his last words were, "Too late," or "This is fidelity." Others preserve what became his most famous final statement, words that captured everything about who he was and who he had wanted to be. "Qualis artifex pereo." What an artist dies in me.
Not what an emperor dies, not what a ruler dies, an artist.
To the very end, that was how he saw himself. Not as a failure of governance, but as a tragedy of unrealized artistic potential. The empire he had misruled, the people he had terrorized, the lives he had destroyed, all of that was secondary to the performances never given, the songs never perfectly sung, the acclaim never fully earned. He died shortly after, on June 9th, 68 AD, at the age of 30 years and 6 months. He had been emperor for 13 years, 8 months, and 13 days. The Julio-Claudian dynasty, which had ruled Rome since Augustus transformed it from republic to empire, died with him. His burial was hasty, incomplete. 2 of Nero's old nurses and a former mistress claimed the body. They cremated him on a pyre of expensive wood in the gardens of Domitia, the estate that had belonged to his father's family. His ashes were placed in a family tomb, no grand mausoleum, no state funeral, no divine honors, just ashes in a box. The mortal remains of an emperor who had wanted to be immortal. The soldier's cloak that the centurion had used to try to stanch his wound was stained with imperial blood. According to legend, that cloak eventually became a relic, preserved by those who believed, against all evidence,
against all reason, that Nero had not been a monster, but a martyr.
That his death was not justice, but tragedy. History would debate what he truly was. But in that small room, in that moment, he was simply a frightened man who could not bring himself to die with dignity, who needed help even to accomplish his own suicide, whose last thoughts were of applause that would never come. The curtain fell. The performance was over. The audience had already left. The Senate moved against Nero's memory with vindictive efficiency. Damnatio memoriae, damnation of memory, was declared. His statues were torn down and smashed. His images were chiseled from monuments.
His name was scratched from inscriptions.
Every trace of Nero was to be erased, as if 30 years of his life and 13 years of his reign had never existed. His golden house, that vast palace complex that had consumed so much of Rome's wealth and space, was systematically demolished. The artificial lake was drained and filled in. On that spot, the Colosseum would eventually rise, a monument to public entertainment rather than imperial indulgence. The elaborate halls with their rotating dining rooms and golden decorations were stripped, buried, repurposed. Within decades, it was as if the Domus Aurea had been a fever dream. The historical record that survived was written entirely by his enemies. Tacitus, Suetonius, Cassius Dio, all wrote during the dynasties that followed. All had incentives to portray the last Julio Claudian as a monster. They recorded every scandal, every excess, every crime. They presented him as mad, cruel, depraved, the ultimate example of what happened when absolute power corrupted absolutely. Yet something strange happened. Even as the elite tried to erase him, popular memory refused to let him go. Among the common people, particularly in the Greek-speaking East, where his love of Hellenic culture had made him popular,
a legend began to form. Nero was not really dead. The Nero Redivivus myth claimed he had escaped,
fled to Parthia, and would someday return at the head of an Eastern army to reclaim his throne. For decades after his death, multiple false Neros appeared, each claiming to be the emperor returned. Some gained significant followings before being exposed or killed. The myth persisted because many common people had actually liked Nero. He had given them games, reduced taxes for the poor, shown respect for Greek culture, patronized the arts. Early Christians developed their own Nero legend. The Book of Revelation, written perhaps 20 years after his death, contains coded references to him. The infamous number of the beast, 6666, is likely a numerological cipher for Nero Caesar. In Christian apocalyptic thought, Nero became the Antichrist, the enemy of God, who persecuted the faithful. Yet even this demonization testified to his enduring importance. They could not ignore him. As centuries passed, the legend evolved. Medieval Christians knew Nero as the ultimate persecutor, the emperor who martyred Peter and Paul. Renaissance humanists reading the ancient sources saw him as a cautionary tale about tyranny. Romantic era writers found in him a tragic figure, an artist destroyed by the demands of power he never wanted. Modern historians have attempted more nuanced assessments. Some argue the ancient sources exaggerated his crimes, that later dynasties needed to discredit the Julio-Claudians to legitimize their own rule. Others suggest Nero was incompetent rather than evil, a man promoted beyond his capabilities who made terrible decisions without fully understanding their consequences. Still others maintain that the traditional view is essentially correct. He was a narcissistic tyrant whose artistic pretensions made him peculiarly dangerous. The truth, perhaps, is that Nero was all of these things simultaneously. He was genuinely talented artistically, not the genius he believed himself to be, but competent. He was genuinely interested in Greek culture and philosophy. He did implement some good policies during the quinquennium, yet he was also capable of ordering his mother's murder without remorse, of watching Christians burn as human torches, of killing his pregnant wife in rage. What makes Nero endlessly fascinating is not that he was simply evil, but that he was complex. He wanted to be loved but chose methods that guaranteed hatred. He craved artistic immortality but achieved only infamy. He valued performance over governance, beauty over responsibility, applause over respect. He was an artist forced to be emperor, and he destroyed both himself and his empire, trying to be both. His legacy is everywhere. The word Nero became synonymous with tyranny. His image appears in art, literature, film and music across 2,000 years. He has been portrayed as monster, as misunderstood genius, as tragic figure, as warning, as symbol. Each age recreates Nero according to its own fears and fascinations. Perhaps that is fitting. Nero wanted to be remembered, wanted his performances to echo through eternity. He got his wish, though not in any way he would have wanted. He performs still on the stage of historical memory, but the role he plays is not artist, but villain, not genius, but cautionary tale. In the end, perhaps his last words were more prophetic than he knew. What an artist died in him, but what died was not greatness but potential, not achievement but possibility. He had every advantage, power, wealth, education, talent, and he squandered them all. That is his true tragedy and his lasting lesson. History remembers Nero not as he wished to be remembered, but as he deserved to be. The emperor who fiddled while Rome burned, whether he actually did or not, because sometimes perception is more powerful than truth. Sometimes the legend matters more than the reality. And Nero, who lived his entire life performing roles, became in death the ultimate performance, a symbol, a myth, a monster, an artist, forever frozen in the amber of historical memory, forever playing his final scene, forever dying with those words on his lips. What an artist dies in me. The curtain never truly falls. The performance never really ends. 2,000 years later, we still watch, still judge, still wonder what might have been if the boy born in Antium had been allowed to be simply an artist instead of an emperor. But history does not traffic in what might have been, only records what was. And what was, in the case of Nero, was tragedy. Greek tragedy transported to Rome, performed on the grandest stage imaginable, with the entire empire as audience. The mad emperor who burned Rome, whether in fact or only in legend, taught us something essential about power, about art, about the human need for recognition, and the terrible things we do to achieve it. That lesson echoes still wherever tyrants confuse control with acclaim, wherever power drowns out wisdom, wherever someone mistakes applause for love. What an artist dies in all of us when we mistake what we want to be for what we actually are. That was Nero's final gift to history, a mirror showing us what happens when ambition and self-delusion meet absolute power. We look into that mirror still, uncomfortable with what we see reflected there. The performance is over, but the memory remains, as Nero would have wanted,
as Nero feared forever.